She threw her wedding ring into the snow the night she ran. Not because she'd ever worn it willingly. Because her father had pressed it into her palm that morning, like a sentence cold final and without appeal, and told her she would marry Nathaniel Barron by Friday, or she would have nothing. No home, no name, no future that belonged to her. Evelyn Cross chose nothing, and now here she is, standing at the edge of a Montana town she's never heard of in the middle of a blizzard that's trying to kill her with 43 cents in her coat pocket and a name she can never say out loud again. If this story already has you gripping the edge of your seat, don't go anywhere. Hit that subscribe button right now, ring the notification bell so you never miss a story, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale has traveled. Now let's find out what happens when the most dangerous man in Black Hollow decides that a woman worth saving is worth keeping. The saloon door didn't want to let her in. It swung heavy on its hinges, fighting the wind, and Evelyn had to put her whole body into it, both hands flat against the weathered wood boots, slipping on the iced-over step teeth clenched so hard her jaw ached. When it finally gave, she stumbled through into noise and heat, and the sharp sour smell of whiskey and wet wool. And for one merciful second, she just stood there breathing. Nobody noticed her. Or if they did, they pretended not to, which was the same thing in a place like this. She pushed the snow off her shoulders and took stock. The room was maybe 40 feet wide, low-ceilinged, packed with the kind of men who had nowhere better to be on a Tuesday night in a Montana blizzard. Card tables in the back. A bar running the length of the left wall. A woman in a red dress carrying drinks like she'd been doing it since she was 15 and expected to be doing it when she was 60. A wood stove in the corner, radiating enough heat to make Evelyn's half-frozen fingers scream back to life. She needed warmth. She needed water. She needed to not be noticed. 2 out of 3 wasn't going to happen. She'd made it halfway to the bar when the first one stepped into her path. Big man. Broad through the chest. The kind of smile that had never once been mistaken for friendly. "Well now," he said. "What do we have here?" It wasn't a question. Evelyn didn't slow down. "Excuse me?" He didn't move. "You alone, sweetheart?" "I'm trying to get to the bar. Bar'll keep." He reached out and caught her arm just above the elbow fingers, wrapping tight enough to bruise. "Why don't you sit with us a while? Warm up proper." She looked down at his hand on her arm. Then she looked up at his face. She kept her voice very level, the way her mother had taught her. Not because her mother had been strong, but because her mother had learned that a steady voice sometimes bought you another 30 seconds, and 30 seconds could be enough. "Take your hand off me," she said. He laughed. The 2 men at the table behind him laughed. The rest of the room went carefully about its business. "Ain't you something?" he said. "Little thing with a big voice. Where you headed in weather like this can't be anywhere worth getting to." "That's my concern." "Might be mine too. I decide I'm interested." She pulled. He held. She was tired. God, she was so tired. 3 days on a train and 6 hours in a stagecoach that broke an axle 4 miles outside of town, and then 4 miles on foot through snow that went to her knees in places, and the fear she'd been keeping behind her back teeth for 300 miles was starting to push forward, and she hated it, because fear was the one thing she could not afford to show. "Let her go." The voice came from the right. Low. Unhurried. The kind of voice that didn't need to compete with the room because the room was already listening. The big man turned. Evelyn turned. I was leaning against the bar with a glass of something amber in his hand, and he hadn't moved, hadn't stood up straighter, or squared his shoulders, or done any of the things men did when they were making a point with their bodies. I was just standing there, easy as anything, looking at the big man, the way you look at a problem you've already solved in your head and are just waiting for the world to catch up. Dark-haired, tall, a face that had been through weather and hadn't apologized for it. A scar along the left jaw, faint old. Eyes that were some color between gray and green and weren't particularly warm, but were extremely precisely awake. He wore a coat the color of dried tobacco, trail-worn at the elbows, and a hat he hadn't bothered to take off. There was a badge on his chest. No, she looked again, no badge. Just the man. "Colt," the big man said, and the way he said the name told Evelyn everything she needed to know about the room. "You heard me, Decker." Still not moving. Let her go. Decker's hand loosened, not because he wanted to, because something in that quiet voice had done a calculation he didn't like the answer to. Evelyn stepped back. She kept her chin up. Colt pushed off the bar and walked over. Not fast, just steady, and stopped between her and Decker with his back mostly to Decker, which was either the most confident thing she'd ever seen or the most reckless. "You all right, ma'am?" he said. Up close, his voice had a rougher edge to it, like gravel under a boot heel, but the question was genuine. He was actually asking. Not performing concern for the room's benefit, actually looking at her, checking her face, waiting for an honest answer. "I'm fine," she said. Then, because she was raised to be honest, even when it cost her, "My arm hurts." Something moved behind his eyes. Not pity. She would have hated pity. Something more like recognition. "You need a place to sit," he said. "I need water and something hot to eat, and then I'll be out of everyone's way." "Sit down," he said. It wasn't unkind. "I'll get you what you need." She sat because her legs were making the decision for her. He went to the bar and said something to the woman in the red dress, who nodded and disappeared through a back door, and then he came back with a tin cup of water and set it in front of her and sat down across the table, like this was a perfectly ordinary situation, and she was a perfectly ordinary woman who'd walked out of a blizzard into his evening. She drank the whole cup without stopping. "How long were you out in that?" he asked. 4 miles, maybe more." "Stagecoach. Broken axle." He nodded once, like that confirmed something. "Anyone else come in with you?" "No." She set the cup down. "I was alone." "Where you headed?" She looked at him. He looked back. He wasn't pushing. The question was practical, not invasive, but she'd learned in the last 3 days that every question had a price, and she was running short on currency she could afford to spend. "Somewhere north," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "That narrows it down." "It's all I've got right now." He didn't push. The woman in the red dress, Evelyn would learn later, her name was Pearl, and that she'd been running this saloon since her husband died of a fever 6 years ago, and hadn't missed a day since. Came back with a bowl of something that steamed, and a wedge of bread, and Evelyn ate it with her hands wrapped around the bowl and her eyes on the door, watching for faces she recognized. "You're watching the door," Colt said. "I'm watching the snow." "You're watching the door," he said again, the same way, and she stopped pretending. "There may be men looking for me," she said. She said it quietly, flatly, because there was no point dressing it up. "I don't know how far behind they are. I don't know if they came this direction." He didn't react. Not visibly. She watched his hands, a habit she'd developed young, reading her father by his hands before his face could lie to her, and they stayed still on the table, relaxed. No change. "What kind of men?" he said. "Hired men. They work for a man named Nathaniel Barron. He's—" She stopped. "He's the man my father promised me to." "Against your will." "Against every part of me that exists," she said. There was a silence. Outside, the wind hit the side of the building hard enough to shudder the walls. "How long ago did you leave?" he asked. 3 days. "Did they know which train?" "No, but they know I was heading west and there aren't many routes." I was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone working up the nerve to say something uncomfortable. The quiet of someone who'd already made a decision and was just organizing the words. "What's your name?" he said. "Evelyn. Evelyn Cross." "Colt Mercer." He didn't offer his hand. Neither did she. "Miss Cross, I'm going to say something to you, and I need you to hear it the way I mean it, which is practical and not anything else." She waited. "If Barron's men come through that door tonight, and if they've been following your route, there's a fair chance they will. You being alone in this room is a problem. A woman alone, no connections in town, no husband, no kin. You've got no standing. They can claim you're a runaway wife or a thief or anything else they want to call you, and half this town will help them load you in a wagon before anyone asks a question." She knew this. She'd known it since Kansas. It was the specific shape of the trap she was in, not just the man pursuing her, but the world that would hand her back to him. "But," Colt said, "if you've got a husband even for one night, that changes the math." She looked at him. "I'm not asking anything from you," he said immediately. "Not one single thing. I'm offering you cover. A name. My name tonight if Baron's men show up and start asking questions. That's all." "Why?" she said. He picked up his glass, looked at it, set it down. "Because I was in a war, and I've seen what it looks like when someone can't protect themselves through no fault of their own, and I got tired of walking past it." It was the most honest thing she'd heard in 3 days, possibly longer. "You don't know me," she said. "No. I could be exactly what they say I am." "Are you?" "No." "Then we're fine," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. This quiet, scarred, self-possessed man, who'd pulled her out of Decker's grip without raising his voice, and was now offering her his name, like it was a coat in the cold. Something practical and necessary, and no more complicated than that. "One night," she said. "One night," he agreed. She nodded. And that was the moment. Not the kiss. The title promised. Not the standoff that was still coming. Not the morning that would rewrite everything. But this moment. This plain and private agreement between two people who'd each run out of other options that everything would hinge on before it was done. She'd barely finished the thought when the door opened. Not the wind, this time. The door opened deliberately with purpose, and the man who stepped through it had the look of someone who'd been given a photograph and a name and a salary, and didn't much care what state he was in when he found what he was looking for. He was lean, clean-shaved, good coat. The coat was the giveaway, too good for this town, too new for this weather, the kind of coat a man wore when someone else was paying his expenses. Behind him, 2 more. They stood inside the door and let their eyes adjust, and then the lean one started a slow, systematic scan of the room. Evelyn's hands went flat on the table. Under the table, without looking, Colt's boot moved to press lightly against hers. "Stay still." She stayed still. The lean man's eyes moved, stopped, on her. Colt stood up, not dramatically, not in a rush. He stood up the way a man stands up from his own table in his own home, easy and unhurried, and he moved around to Evelyn's side and put his hand on the back of her chair, and then he looked at the lean man with that expression. She was already learning to read that calm, patient, absolutely immovable expression that said he had already decided how this was going to go, and was willing to wait as long as necessary for the room to agree with him. "Help you," Colt said. The lean man looked at him, then at Evelyn, then back at him. "Looking for a woman, traveling alone, brown hair, about so tall." He gestured. He wasn't looking at Evelyn when he said it, he was watching Colt's face. "Lots of women in Montana," Colt said. "This one's particular. Name of Cross. Evelyn Cross. She's the intended of a Mr. Nathaniel Barron out of Denver. Ran off 3 days ago. Mr. Barron is very concerned for her welfare." "I'll bet he is," Colt said. The lean man smiled a little. "You seen anyone matching that description?" Colt looked down at Evelyn. She looked up at him. She did not know in that precise second what her face was doing. She was too tired and too scared to manage it. But whatever it was, he met it steadily. And then he looked back at the lean man. "My wife came in out of the storm about an hour ago," he said. "She's the only woman I've seen traveling alone tonight, and I wouldn't call it traveling so much as surviving." He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down close, his arm along the back of her chair like it belonged there. "She's also not Evelyn Cross." "That right?" The lean man's eyes moved back to her. "What's your name, ma'am?" She had one heartbeat to decide. "Evelyn Mercer," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady. The lean man held her gaze for 5 seconds. She counted. She had always been good at counting under pressure. It was the one thing she'd found that kept the fear from her voice. Then he looked at Colt. "You can vouch for that." "I just did," Colt said. Was there something unclear about it? Another silence. The room had gone very still around them. Pearl frozen behind the bar. Decker and his friends suddenly very interested in their cards. The rest of the men doing the particular Western thing of being present without appearing to witness anything. The lean man looked at Evelyn one more time. At Colt. At Evelyn. "My apologies for the interruption," he said finally, the way men say things they don't mean when they can't afford to mean anything else. "Enjoy your evening." He turned. His 2 men turned with him. The door opened, the cold came in, and then they were gone. Nobody in the room said anything. Then Pearl put a fresh glass in front of Colt and said without inflection, "On the house." Colt picked it up, didn't drink it right away, just held it. Evelyn let out a breath she'd been holding since Kansas. "They'll check," she said quietly. "They'll ask around. Someone will tell them you don't have a wife." "Someone probably will," he agreed. "Then we have until morning." "Maybe less." He set the glass down. "There's a spare room at my place. You'll have a roof and a lock on the door and a stove that works. Tomorrow, when the storm clears, we figure out the next part." "You don't have to." "I know I don't," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." She looked at him, at his hands on the table still and easy, at the scar on his jaw, at the eyes that were watching her with nothing in them that she needed to be afraid of. "Why are you like this?" she said, and she didn't mean it as a challenge. She meant it as a genuine question, the kind you ask when something doesn't fit the shape of the world as you know it. He considered it seriously the way he seemed to consider everything. "My mother raised me right," he said. "And then the war showed me what happens when people don't act like it. I decided I'd rather be the first kind." She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. He left money on the table for Pearl and stood up and offered his hand, not romantically, not with any weight to it, just an offer of steadiness, and she took it and stood up, and they walked out of the saloon and into the blizzard together, and the cold hit her like a wall, and his shoulder was right there next to her, blocking some of the wind, not making a production of it, just present. The snow was coming sideways now. She could barely see 10 feet ahead. "Stay close," he said. She did. They walked into the white dark, and somewhere behind them, in a town she'd arrived in, alone and unnamed, 3 men in good coats were asking questions. But she wasn't alone anymore. And her name for tonight at least was Mercer. She didn't know yet what it would be by morning. She didn't know that by the time the blizzard broke, she wouldn't want to give it back. She didn't know any of it. She just walked, and the cowboy beside her kept the wind off her left side the whole way home, and somewhere inside the tightest, most defended room in her chest, something that had been locked for a very long time, turned very quietly. One click toward open. The spare room was exactly what he'd promised: a roof, a lock, a stove that worked. Evelyn sat on the edge of the narrow bed and listened to the blizzard tear at the walls and tried to remember the last time she'd felt safe enough to cry. She couldn't. She didn't cry now either. She just sat there with her hands in her lap and her boots still on, because taking her boots off felt like a decision she wasn't ready to make, like it would mean something about staying that she hadn't agreed to yet. She heard him moving on the other side of the wall, not pacing. Colt. Mercer didn't pace. She already knew that about him. He was a man who moved with intention, or didn't move at all. Boots on the floor. Something set down on a table. The soft chunk of wood going into a stove. Then quiet. She unlaced her boots. She was asleep before she meant to be sitting up, and she woke to gray light coming through the single window, and the sound of voices downstairs, not loud but sharp, with an edge that pulled her back from sleep like a hand on her collar. She was at the door before she was fully awake. She pressed her ear to the wood. "Don't care what you say you saw. The woman arrived alone. We have 3 witnesses. That was the lean man." His voice was different in the morning, less careful, less patient. "And I'm telling you, she's my wife." Colt. Flat, unhurried, the same voice he'd used on Decker. "I don't know what your witnesses think they saw. People see what they expect to see in a snowstorm." "Mr. Mercer." A pause. "We can do this simply, or we can involve the county sheriff. Your choice." "Involve whoever you like," Colt said. "My wife is upstairs sleeping. I'd appreciate you keeping your voice down." Evelyn opened the door and walked out. She didn't think about it. There was no plan. Her mind made one calculation in under a second. They were losing ground, and the only play left was to stop defending and move forward, and her body was already on the stairs before the rest of her caught up. She came down in her stockinged feet, her hair loose from sleep, wearing yesterday's dress because she had no other, and she looked at the lean man and his 2 companions filling Colt's front room, and she didn't stop walking until she was standing next to Colt, close enough that her arm pressed against his. "Is something wrong?" she said. Her voice was thick with sleep, and she let it be because a woman woken from her own bed sounds different from a woman trying to perform innocence. The lean man stared at her. She stared back. "Ma'am," he said, "I apologize for waking you. We're looking for a young woman." "You're looking for me," she said, "and I'm going to save us all some time and tell you that you won't find me because I am not whoever Nathan Barron says I am to him. I'm Evelyn Mercer. I have been Evelyn Mercer for 14 months. She felt Colt go very still beside her. "And if Mr. Barron has a document that says otherwise, I'd like to see it, because my husband has very good lawyers, and we would both enjoy the opportunity to discuss the legality of any claim that man thinks he has on me." The lean man's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Mercer." "That's correct," she said. "Mrs. Mercer, you can write that down if it helps." A long silence. The two men behind the lean one exchanged a look. The lean man looked at Colt. Colt looked back at him with the particular expression of a man who is very comfortable and sees no reason to change that. "We'll be in town a few more days," the lean man said finally, "in case anything clarifies." "Enjoy the weather," Colt said. They left. The door shut behind them, and Evelyn stood in the sudden quiet with her arms crossed over her chest and her heart slamming against her ribs like it was trying to get out of the building ahead of her. 14 months, Colt said. She turned to look at him. "You said we've been married 14 months, he said. There was something in his voice she couldn't read yet. Not anger, not amusement exactly. Something in between. "In case they check." "Is that a problem?" "No," he said slowly. "It's actually smart. You gave us a specific number. Vague is what falls apart under pressure." He looked at her for a moment. "You've done this before. Thought fast under pressure." "I grew up with my father," she said. "You learn to be 3 moves ahead, or you lose." He nodded once. Then he went to the kitchen, and she heard him start a fire under the coffee pot, and she stood there in her stockinged feet, realizing she'd just made everything significantly more complicated and felt against all reason, something very close to satisfaction about it. She was still processing that when he called from the kitchen. "You want eggs?" "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, "Please." They ate at his kitchen table with the storm still going outside. Quieter now, and she told him about Nathaniel Barron between bites because he needed to know the whole shape of the thing to protect against it. Barron was 38. Inherited money, railroad contracts, political connections that went 3 layers deep in the Colorado state government. Her father owed him a debt, not money, something worse, the kind of debt that gets paid in daughters. She'd found out on a Tuesday. She'd been on a train by Thursday. "He'll keep coming," she said. "Not because he loves me. He doesn't know me. He'll keep coming because letting me go is embarrassing, and embarrassment costs him something." "What does he lose if he can't bring you back?" "Pride. Leverage over my father. The appearance of control." She pushed her fork through what was left on her plate. "Men like Barron don't need to want something to pursue it. They just need to have said they would." Colt was quiet for a moment. "He sent 3 men. He'll send more." "How many more?" "As many as it takes," she said. "He has the money for it." Colt set his coffee down. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then at her, and she could see him doing the math, and she waited for it. The calculation where a stranger's problem stops being worth the cost the moment the door opens in a man's expression and he starts looking for a way to hand it back to her politely. It didn't come. "All right," he said. "Then we need to make it real." She went still. "What?" "The story. 14 months. It needs to hold up, which means there are things I need to know about you, and things you need to know about me. And we need to know them the way married people know them, not the way strangers with a script know them." He picked his coffee back up. "They'll ask around town. Mrs. Aldred at the general store will tell them everything she knows about everyone within a 10-mile radius. If our stories don't line up down to the small details, she'll say so, and they'll know." "What kind of details?" "How do you take your coffee?" "With sugar. 2. He nodded and filed it away with the visible seriousness of a man building a structure. "Your middle name?" "Grace." "Where we met?" She looked at him. "Where did we meet?" Denver, he said. I was there on cattle business. You were visiting my cousin, she said. I have a real cousin in Denver. If they check that, it'll hold. Good. Visiting your cousin. We met at church, she said. It's harder to poke holes in church. Something happened in his eyes. Not quite a smile, but in that direction. Church, he said. Fine. 6 months of letters. 3 trips I made to Denver before I asked your father. Married in April 14 months ago. Small ceremony. Your father wasn't. He stopped. My father wasn't there, she said. He had a prior commitment. The particular flatness in her voice said everything about what kind of prior commitment it was. Colt heard it. He didn't comment on it. We've been at the ranch since May of last year. You've met my neighbor Walt Greer and his wife Helen. Pearl at the saloon. He thought. Noah. Who's Noah? Something changed in his face. Not much. A small tightening around the eyes, the kind that comes with names that matter. My nephew. He's 9. He lives here. His mother, my sister, she passed 2 years ago. I'm all he's got. Evelyn absorbed this. The man across from her had just handed her something real, something that cost him to say, and she understood instinctively that it wasn't part of the cover story. It was an answer to the question she hadn't asked, why a man like this had a spare room and a kitchen and a house instead of a bunkhouse, why he stayed instead of moving on the way hard men usually did. He stayed because of a 9-year-old boy who had nowhere else to go. Where is he now? She asked. Walt and Helen's. I sent him there 2 days ago when the storm started coming. A pause. He'll be back tomorrow. You should know he's going to have questions. He's 9. He always has questions. I like questions, she said. He looked at her like he was deciding something. Then he said, You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone scared, he said. You're scared, but it's not the first thing. The first thing is angry, she said honestly. It's been angry for a long time. The scared is underneath. That's how it ought to be, he said. Fear's useful when it's under something solid. When it's on top, it runs you. She thought about that. About her father's study, and the cold ring in her palm, and the specific quality of the silence, after he'd told her she had no choice. She'd been scared then. But she'd also, somewhere very deep, been absolutely done. Done the way a rope goes when it's held too long under too much weight, not fraying, not weakening, just reaching the point where it decides to be something else. Someone's coming to the door, Colt said. She hadn't heard anything. He was already standing. 3 sharp knocks. He opened it and a boy blew in with the remaining snow, red-cheeked and bundled to the eyebrows, unwrapping a scarf from his face with the determined efficiency of a small person who had somewhere important to be. Walt said the storm's almost done and I could come back, the boy announced. Also, Mrs. Helen says you need to eat more vegetables, and she sent a pie. But I think pie is a vegetable if you put enough apples in it. He stopped. He'd finally seen Evelyn. He stared. Who's that? Noah, Colt said. This is Evelyn. She's your wife, Evelyn said. Noah's eyes went very wide. He looked at his uncle, then at her, then at his uncle again. You got married. About 14 months ago, Colt said with perfect calm. You never said anything. It didn't come up. Noah turned back to Evelyn with the unfiltered assessment that only children and very honest adults deploy. He looked at her hair still loose from sleep, her stockinged feet on the cold floor, the way she was sitting at his uncle's kitchen table with a coffee cup in front of her, like she'd been there all winter. You have a lot of hair, he said. I do, she agreed. Uncle Colt doesn't like it when the horses have tangles. Do you have tangles? Noah, Colt said. Probably, Evelyn said. It was a long night. Noah considered this with great seriousness. Then he sat down at the table across from her, dropped his scarf on the floor and said, Did you bring anything? Helen always brings pie. Uncle Colt usually brings jerky. What do you bring? I just brought myself, she said. I'm sorry. I thought about this. That's okay, he said finally. We can share the pie. Evelyn looked at Colt over the boy's head. He was looking at them both with something on his face that he was working to keep neutral and wasn't entirely succeeding. It was the first unguarded thing she'd seen from him, and it lasted maybe 2 seconds before he put it away, but she saw it. He hadn't expected her to be easy with the boy. He'd braced for awkward. She filled him a cup of hot water with the last of the sugar, and Noah wrapped both hands around it and talked for 20 straight minutes about a horse named Captain and a boy at school named Jeremiah who had claimed to have seen a bear, and Noah was 80% sure was lying, and somewhere in the middle of it. Evelyn stopped tracking the door and stopped counting the seconds since the lean man had left, and just sat in Colt Mercer's kitchen drinking coffee that was too strong and listening to a 9-year-old have opinions about bears. It was the most ordinary thing that had happened to her in a very long time. It was, she realized, what she'd been running toward without knowing it had a shape. She was still thinking about that when she heard boots on the porch again. Not Noah's stomping, not the careful, deliberate step she was learning to recognize as Colt's. 3 sets of boots. Heavier. Purposeful. Noah heard it too. He stopped talking about Jeremiah mid-sentence and looked at the door. Colt was already there, and his hand was at his side, and his face had gone back to that carved, still quality that she now understood was not coldness, but concentration. The face of a man who has survived dangerous things by doing one thing at a time and doing it completely. He looked back at her. One look. It said, "Stay with the boy." She moved her chair so she was between Noah and the door. The knock came. Hard. The kind that's not really a question. Colt opened it. The lean man again. But this time, he hadn't brought his 2 quiet companions. He'd brought someone else, a man in a suit that had no business being in Montana in any season, with soft hands and sharp eyes, and the particular expression of someone who has never once in his life been told no, and has stopped believing the word exists. Nathaniel Barron had come himself. Nathaniel Barron stepped inside like he owned the floor beneath his feet, the way men do when they've spent their whole lives walking into rooms that rearrange themselves around them. I was younger than Evelyn had imagined. She didn't know why she'd built him older in her mind, maybe because her father had spoken of him with the particular deference reserved for men who'd already arrived somewhere, men whose futures were settled facts rather than possibilities. But Barron was perhaps 40, and he carried himself with the specific confidence of someone who had learned early that money moved faster than character and had made his peace with that. He looked at the room, at Colt, at Noah, then at Evelyn, and his eyes stopped. "Evelyn," he said. Not a question, not a greeting. Just her name said the way you say the name of a thing you've already decided belongs to you. "Mr. Barron," she said, "you look well." He said it pleasantly, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. I was concerned. A woman traveling alone in this kind of weather, anything might have happened. "Nothing did," she said. "As you can see." "Yes." His eyes moved to Colt. "I don't believe we've met." Colt Mercer. Colt didn't move from where he stood, didn't extend a hand, didn't do any of the social things that would have closed the distance between them. He just held his ground and looked at Barron the way he looked at everything steadily without performance. Her husband. Something moved across Barron's face. Not surprised, the lean man would have told him he'd have known before he knocked, but something below surprise, something uglier and more controlled. He turned it into a smile before it finished forming. "So I've heard," Barron said. "I have to admit, Evelyn, I was skeptical. You never mentioned a husband." "I didn't think my personal life was relevant to a business arrangement my father made without consulting me," she said. The smile stayed. It was very good, she noted. Well practiced. The kind of smile that had probably convinced 100 rooms full of people that this was a reasonable man having a reasonable conversation. "Your father and I had an understanding." "My father," she said, "had a debt. You offered to settle it in exchange for me. That's not an understanding. That's a transaction, and I'm not property." Barron tilted his head slightly. "You're very direct. I've had a few days to get comfortable with it." He looked at Colt again. "Mr. Mercer, I'd like to speak with Miss Cross, privately. As I'm sure you can appreciate, there are matters between our families that require..." There's nothing between your families that involves my wife, Colt said. And there's nothing you need to say to her that you can't say in front of me. I see. Barron studied him. Evelyn had the feeling he was doing what she'd seen him do with her name cataloging assessing, looking for the price. You're protective. That's admirable. But you should understand that the situation is more complicated than Evelyn may have led you to believe. Try me, Colt said. Barron reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out not to Colt, but toward the center of the room, so that both of them would have to come forward to take it. A small power move. Evelyn recognized it because her father had done it her whole life. She crossed the room and took it herself. She unfolded it, read it. Her hands stayed still. It was a letter from her father. Signed, witnessed, dated 2 weeks ago, after she'd already been gone a week. In it, her father stated that Evelyn Cross had agreed to a formal betrothal to Nathaniel Barron, that the agreement had been made in good faith, and that any subsequent claim of marriage to another party should be considered fraudulent, as Evelyn had been at the time of any such claimed ceremony already spoken for under the laws of the state of Colorado. Her father had backdated her consent, had forged her agreement, had put his name on a lie and sent it 3 states west to hand her back to a man she'd never chosen. She folded the paper very carefully. She kept her face the same. She handed it to Colt. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. Noah, he said without looking up from the document. Go check on Captain. Noah, who had been sitting so still, he'd nearly disappeared, slid off his chair and went out the back without a word. The boy was smarter than he looked, which was saying something because he looked plenty smart. Colt finished reading. He folded the paper the same way she had and held it for a moment, then set it on the table. Then he looked at Barron. This letter is dated October 14th, he said. I married Evelyn in April, 14 months ago. He let that sit for a second. Your document is either fraudulent or your lawyer can't read a calendar. Either way, it doesn't change anything. Courts may see it differently, Barron said. You're welcome to find one willing to hear it, Colt said. In the meantime, you're in my home, and I'm asking you to leave it. Barron looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him and felt something she hadn't expected. Not fear, which had been her companion for 300 miles, but a cold, clarifying fury, the kind that doesn't shake, the kind that settles. You went to a great deal of trouble, Barron said to her, for a woman with so few options. I seem to have found some, she said, for now. He buttoned his coat. The gesture was unhurried, deliberate, the gesture of a man who has decided to allow something rather than having it decided for him. Mr. Mercer, I respect a man who takes care of what's his. A pause on that word, his loaded with something she was supposed to hear. I'll be in town a while longer, in case anything changes. Nothing's going to change, Colt said. Barron smiled, nodded once to the lean man at his shoulder, and left. The door shut. Colt stood without moving for 3 full seconds. Then he picked the document up off the table and read it again slowly the second time. He had your father sign that, he said. My father signed it himself, she said. Willingly. That's his hand. I know his signature. He backdated your consent. Yes. He can use this to claim the marriage is invalid, that you were already legally contracted to Barron when the wedding happened. Yes. She sat down because her legs decided to without consulting the rest of her. He's been planning this. He didn't come up here on short notice. He had this ready. Colt set the paper down again. His jaw was set hard. How much does your father owe him? I don't know exactly. Enough that signing that letter was easier than finding another way to pay. Does your father know what Barron is? She looked at her hands. My father knows exactly what Barron is. That's why he chose him. The silence that followed, that was a particular kind. Not awkward, not searching. Just the silence of someone absorbing something painful and deciding not to look away from it. Evelyn, Colt said. She looked up. I need you to know something. That document, it doesn't change what I said at the door. You're not going anywhere with him. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He said it the same way he'd said it the night before in the saloon with the same flat certainty. I'm saying it because it's true, not because you need me to say it. She nodded. She didn't trust her voice right then, and she knew it. I went to the window and stood there thinking, and she watched him do it. Watched the particular quality of his stillness, the way he worked through things on the inside, where it didn't show. After a while he said, "Walt Greer has been in this county for 20 years. He's got relationships with the circuit judge and the land office and half the county commissioners. If Barron tries to push this through a legal channel, Walt can slow it down." Slowing it down isn't stopping it. No, he agreed. But it buys time. Time is what we need right now. He turned around. The real problem isn't the document. The document is paper. The real problem is that he came himself, which means he's not going to send more men and wait. He's here, and he's going to push. A pause. He's going to look for something to use, something that breaks the story. "What breaks the story?" she said. "Something a wife wouldn't know. Something she'd know about her husband that a stranger wouldn't have had time to learn." He looked at her steadily. "So we fix that now. You ask me what you need to know. I'll ask you the same." She almost said, "This is a lot for a one-night arrangement." She didn't. Because it wasn't one night anymore, and they both knew it, and saying it out loud felt like touching something that might break. "Tell me about the ranch," she said instead. "Everything. How you got it, what it runs, the problems with it. Not the good parts, the problems." He sat down. "Back fence line has been in a dispute with a neighbor named Pulliam for 3 years. Water rights to the eastern creek are registered in my name, but Pulliam contests them every spring, like he thinks one year I'll give up. North pasture flooded 2 summers ago, and I lost 40 head. Insurance was less than expected. I had to take a loan from the Billings Bank at 6%, and I've still got 2 years left on it." She was filing all of it. "What do you do when you're angry?" He looked at her. "What?" "If someone pushed you, really pushed you, not Barron just now, but something that actually got under your skin, what do you do?" I was quiet a moment. "I go to the barn. I work until the feeling has somewhere else to go." A pause. "My sister used to say I could fix anything with a hammer except myself." Something moved through Evelyn's chest. She kept her face even. "How did she die?" "Fever. February. It came fast and the doctor was 2 days out. By the time he got there it was done." He said it the way you say things that have been said often enough to stop cutting on the way out, but her voice still wasn't quite flat. There was something under it. Noah was 7. He didn't understand it at first. He kept waiting for her to come back. "Does he still?" "I don't know. He stopped asking." Colt looked at the table. "Some things you just stop asking about and carry instead." The back door opened, and Noah came in stomping snow off his boots with the aggressive thoroughness of a child who has been given a task and completed it to maximum specifications. He looked at both of them, looked at the table, looked at the door. "Is the bad man gone?" he said. Colt looked at him. "What bad man?" "The one in the fancy coat. Helen says men in fancy coats in Montana are either lawyers or liars, and either way, you shouldn't let them in the house." "Helen's a wise woman," Evelyn said. "I know." Noah came and sat down. He looked at Evelyn with that straight, unblinking assessment. "Are you going to have to leave?" She opened her mouth, closed it. "No," Colt said. Noah looked at him. Something passed between them. Uncle and nephew, the private language of 2 people who have managed grief together, and Noah nodded once, like he'd been waiting for someone to just say it plain. "Okay," he said. "Can we have the pie now?" They had the pie. It was apple as promised, and it was good, and nobody said anything about Barron or the document, or the lean man still presumably somewhere in Black Hollow asking questions. They just ate pie at the kitchen table in the gray winter light. 3 people who had arrived at this table by different roads, and Evelyn thought, this is what I was running toward. Not away from my father, not away from Barron. Toward this. A table. A boy who wants pie. A man who says no like he means it. She was still thinking that when Colt's neighbor Walt arrived, red-faced and urgent with mud on his boots and news in his face that wasn't good. "Colt." Walt pulled his hat off. Looked at Evelyn, registered her presence with a single eyebrow that asked a dozen questions he was too polite to voice. "Barron's been to see Judge Haverford." Colt went still. "When?" Hour ago, brought that document. Haverford's. Walt stopped. Looked at Noah. Boy, go see if Captain needs water. Noah went slower this time, dragging his feet in the specific way of a child who wants to be recalled before he gets too far. Colt closed the door behind him. What did Haverford say? Haverford has been trying to get his son a railroad contract for 2 years, Walt said. And Barron holds about 40% of the new Northern Line. He didn't have to say the rest. He's going to move on it, Colt said. He's going to issue a writ. Tomorrow morning if Barron pushes. Day after at the latest. It'll require Evelyn to appear before him and produce documentation of the marriage certificate, witnesses the preacher. Walt looked at her. I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't know your situation fully, but from what Colt told me last night. Last night. She looked at Colt. I rode to Walt's after you were asleep, Colt said. I needed him to know what was happening. What did you tell him? Colt held her gaze. That my wife was in trouble, and I needed a friend who knew the county. Walt cleared his throat. I have to ask because what I do next depends on, is there a marriage certificate, a real one? The silence answered him. Shh. He exhaled, looked at the floor, then looked up. There's a preacher in Harlow Creek, Reverend Moss. He's been doing marriages for 30 years, and he keeps clean records that have held up in 3 different courts. He said it carefully, looking at the window instead of either of them. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just telling you what's true. Colt looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Colt. 14 months ago, she'd put a ring in the snow and chosen nothing over the wrong thing. She'd run 1,000 miles and walked 4 of them in a blizzard, and sat in a stranger's kitchen and told his nephew she'd brought herself and hoped that was enough. Now a man she'd known for less than 48 hours was looking at her with gray-green eyes that asked without asking, and she understood completely without ambiguity that this was a door and she was standing in it, and whatever she said next would close it one way or the other. The fear was there. She acknowledged it, put it underneath. How far is Harlow Creek? She said. Walt's shoulders dropped half an inch. 8 miles. Road's passable now the storm's done. She looked at Colt. You'd be taking on his fight, not just for one night. I'm already in it, he said. I said your name at that door. There's no taking that back. There's a difference between a lie that protects someone for a night and a Evelyn. He said her name the way he said everything once, clearly without decoration. I know the difference. I'm standing here. She thought of her father's signature on a forged document. She thought of Barron's smile. She thought of Noah asking, "Are you going to have to leave?" and Colt saying no before she could form the question herself. She thought of a table and pie, and the way the gray light came through the window and made everything simple. All right, she said. Walt put his hat back on. I'll have the wagon ready in an hour. Colt nodded. Walt went to the door and then stopped and turned back with his hand on the frame and said, "For what it's worth. From where I'm standing, you two already seem more married than half the people Moss has put words over. He's just going to be making it official." He left. The room was quiet. Evelyn looked at her hands, looked at Colt. He was watching her with that careful, present attention, not pushing, not retreating. "You should know," she said, "that I'm not easy to live with. I have opinions about everything, and I don't keep them to myself, and I argue when I think someone's wrong, even when it would be simpler not to." "Good," he said. "I've been wrong before. Nobody here to tell me. I'll want to help with the ranch, not just the kitchen. The contracts, the water rights dispute, the Pulliam situation. I'm good with numbers, and I'm better with legal language than most people expect." "I noticed," he said. "The backdating. You caught it in 10 seconds. I grew up reading my father's contracts looking for the part that was going to hurt me." She paused. "Turns out that's a useful skill." "Turns out," he agreed. They stood across from each other in the kitchen, where they'd eaten pie 20 minutes ago, with a 9-year-old boy, and the wagon was being readied 8 miles from a preacher, and somewhere in Black Hollow, a man in a good coat was leaning on a corrupt judge, and none of that was simple. But Colt Mercer was looking at her like she was something he'd already decided on, and she was looking back at him the same way. And when Noah pushed the back door open and said, "Uncle Colt, Captain has plenty of water. Can I come back now?" both of them said yes at exactly the same moment. Noah looked between them. "You're both weird," he announced and came inside. The wagon ride to Harlow Creek took 40 minutes and nobody said much. Walt drove. Noah sat between him and Colt on the bench up front, asking questions about Reverend Moss with the systematic thoroughness of a boy who had decided that information was the best defense against uncertainty. Was he old? Did he have a beard? Had he ever married anyone who later got unmarried? Colt answered each one with the same patient flatness he brought to everything, and Evelyn sat in the wagon bed behind them, with her hands in her lap, and watched the back of Colt's head, and thought about what she was doing. She knew what she was doing. That was the thing. She wasn't confused about it, wasn't swept up in it the way she might have been at 20, with less experience of what men could cost her. She was 26 years old, and she was choosing this with her eyes open, which was the only way she'd ever wanted to choose anything, and the fact that she was choosing it after 48 hours instead of 48 months didn't make it less of a choice. It made it more of one, actually. There was nothing in it that wasn't deliberate. What she didn't know, what she was still working out in the quiet of the wagon with the cold air on her face, was what Colt was choosing. She knew why he'd offered her cover at the saloon. She knew why he'd gone to Walt. She understood the logic of the preacher, the document, the legal protection. All of that made sense in the practical language that he seemed most comfortable in. What she couldn't yet read was the thing underneath the practical. Whether it was there at all. She was still thinking about it when the wagon stopped. Reverend Moss was 70, if he was a day with a beard that had given up trying to be any particular shape and eyes that were kind, in the way that only comes from having seen a great deal and made peace with most of it. He looked at all of them. Walt, Noah, Colt, Evelyn, and then he looked at Colt. Specifically, the long look of a man who has known someone for years and is reading something new in a familiar face. "Well," he said, "come in then." His front room was warm. He had them sit, which Evelyn did, and then he looked at her directly and said, "I understand the circumstances are somewhat urgent." "Yes," she said. "Are they also genuine?" She met his eyes. "Yes." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. He looked at Colt. "Yes," Colt said. The same word, the same weight. Moss looked at both of them for another long moment, doing the particular calculation that men of faith do when they're deciding whether they're being used or whether they're being needed. And then he said, "I've done 63 marriages in 30 years. About half of them were done in a hurry for one reason or another. In my experience, urgency doesn't determine outcome. Character does." He picked up his Bible from the side table. "Shall we proceed?" They stood. Noah stood next to Walt in the corner and watched with enormous eyes. Moss kept it short. He had the sense not to make it elaborate, which Evelyn appreciated in her bones. He asked them the questions that mattered, and they answered them. And when he got to the part about with this ring, Colt reached into his coat pocket and produced a plain band thin gold worn at the edges, and Evelyn stared at it. "My mother's," he said quietly for her only. "Walt had it. I asked him to bring it." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that steady, unreadable expression, and she understood that he'd planned this before they left, had asked Walt to retrieve it, had thought about this specific moment before she'd fully decided she was going to be in it. He'd been more sure than she'd known. She held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger. Moss said the final words. Colt kissed her brief, proper nothing that performed beyond what the moment required, and Noah said very quietly from the corner, "Oh," as if something had just rearranged itself in his understanding of the world. Walt shook Colt's hand. He looked like he was trying not to be moved and failing. "Took you long enough," he said, which didn't entirely make sense given the timeline, but felt true anyway. On the way back, Noah sat in the wagon bed with Evelyn. "I didn't say anything for a while. Then, does this mean you're staying?" "Yes," she said. "For how long?" "For good," she said. The words felt solid coming out. Not a performance, just true. He thought about this. "Uncle Colt doesn't talk a lot," he said, "in case you didn't notice." "I noticed. He used to talk more, before Mom died." He said it the matter-of-fact way that children sometimes discuss grief, the way that's more devastating than ceremony. He got quieter after. Helen says he put most of himself somewhere safe so it wouldn't get hurt again. He picked at a thread on his coat. I think he was waiting. For what? She said. Noah looked at her like the answer was obvious. For someone to make it worth taking back out. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that. She just sat with it in the cold air and let it settle where it needed to settle. They were 2 miles from the ranch when Colt turned on the bench and said without preamble, "There's a rider behind us." Walt had already seen it. One man. One man isn't Barron, Colt said. Barron doesn't go anywhere alone. He watched the rider for a moment. Too deliberate. He's been following us since Moss's place. The rider caught up at the edge of the property line, and Evelyn recognized him. Not the lean man, not one of the 2 silent companions, but a 4th man she hadn't seen before. Younger, with the uncomfortable look of someone who has been given a job he isn't sure he should have taken. Mr. Mercer. He pulled up. Mr. Barron asked me to deliver a message. Deliver it, Colt said. The young man looked at Evelyn, looked at Colt. Mr. Barron says. He stopped, seemed to be deciding how to phrase it. He says congratulations on the wedding. He was made aware of it promptly. A pause. He also says the document he showed you this morning has been filed with Judge Haverford, and that the judge has agreed to review it and issue a finding on the validity of the marriage. Another pause. By end of week. Evelyn's hands went flat on her knees. Mr. Barron also says, the young man continued with increasing discomfort, that he's prepared to make this simple. He's willing to withdraw the filing if... He stopped again. Looked at Colt directly now, not at Evelyn. If Mrs. Mercer agrees to a private conversation with him. Just a conversation. He gives his word no one else would be present. The air went very still. Colt's voice, when it came, was quieter than she'd ever heard it, which somehow made it more absolute. You go back and tell Barron that my wife doesn't have private conversations with men who file fraudulent documents, and that the word of a man who pays a judge for findings isn't worth the breath it took to speak it. The young man nodded like he'd expected something like this, and was privately relieved to have witnessed it. He turned his horse and went. Walt was already calculating. He had someone at Moss's place watching, he said. Had to. He knew about the wedding too fast. He's been a step ahead the whole time, Colt said. He didn't sound shaken. He sounded like a man who has just confirmed a suspicion he'd rather have been wrong about. Which means he has more patience than I gave him credit for. What do we do? Evelyn asked. Colt turned to look at her. The afternoon light was going, and it put his face half in shadow, and she could see him working it through the same methodical quiet she'd watched that morning in the kitchen. We go home, he said, and I go through every piece of paper I have on this property. Why? Because men like Barron don't just push from one angle, he said. The document is one angle, the judge is another. If he's been planning this, there's a third. She didn't ask how he knew that. She thought she understood. He'd been in a war. He'd learned that the attack you could see was rarely the one that got you. They went home. The ranch settled around them in the particular way of a place that had been silent and was now adjusting to being occupied as if the walls were recalibrating. Noah went to check on Captain with the dedication of a boy who understood that adults sometimes need the room. Walt stayed at the table with a cup of coffee and his hat in his hands, while Colt pulled a wooden box from under his desk and began laying documents out on the table surface. Deed water rights, filing the loan papers from Billings, 3 years of boundary correspondence with Pulliam, and a folder of railroad surveying notices that had arrived over the past year. Evelyn pulled the folder toward her. Railroad surveying. Every property in this part of the county got one, Colt said. Routine, they said. Nothing with Barron is routine. She opened the folder, read the first page, read it again. Colt. He looked up. This survey notation. She turned the page to face him and pointed. This line here, it marks a proposed right-of-way for the northern spur line. Do you see where it runs? He leaned in. Through the eastern pasture. Through your water source, she said. The creek that Pulliam disputes, if the railroad claims right-of-way through that corridor. I lose the water rights entirely, he said. Whether Pulliam's challenge succeeds or not, railroad supersedes both of us. And who holds 40% of the northern line? Walt said from across the table. Nobody answered. The answer was already in the room. Barron hadn't come for Evelyn out of wounded pride. He'd come for the ranch. She was the mechanism. Her father's debt, the betrothal document, the fraudulent claim. All of it designed to destabilize Colt, to put him in a legal fight on one front, while the railroad moved on another, to split his attention and his resources until he couldn't hold both. She was the distraction. The ranch was the target. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. The specific shape of her own usefulness to Barron, the function she'd been assigned without knowing it. Not a bride. A lever. He picked my father on purpose, she said. It wasn't a question. He knew about the ranch. He knew about the water rights. He needed a way onto this property, and my father was the way in. How long has your father owed him? Colt asked. At least 2 years, she said. Maybe 3. The first surveying notice came 22 months ago, Walt said, looking at the stack of papers. He's been patient. He didn't expect her to run, Colt said. He was looking at Evelyn, and there was something in the look she hadn't seen from him yet. Not admiration exactly. Something quieter, something like recognition. He built a plan around a woman who was going to do what she was told. When you didn't, he had to come himself. Which means he's improvising now, she said. And improvising men make mistakes. Walt set his cup down. There's a man in Billings, William Charters. He's the land commissioner for this district. He and Barron are not friendly. He chose the word carefully. If someone were to bring him evidence that Barron is using personal legal pressure to soften up a landowner ahead of a railroad acquisition. That's not just a civil matter, Colt said. No. Walt agreed. It's not. Evelyn looked at the documents, at the survey notation, at the water rights filing and the boundary dispute correspondence, and the timeline that was now visible, the way a pattern is visible once someone turns the paper the right way. I can write the letter, she said. Tonight, if you give me what I need. Both men looked at her. I know how to build a case out of documents, she said. I know how to write in the language that land commissioners read. My father taught me everything he knew about legal correspondence, which was a great deal, and he used it against me, and I would like very much to use it against someone who deserves it instead. Walt looked at Colt. Colt looked at Evelyn. What do you need? Colt said. Everything in that box, she said. And a lamp that works, and a few hours of quiet. He nodded. He went and got the lamp. She worked while the house went quiet around her. Noah to bed. Walt eventually to the spare room, since the ride back to his place in the dark wasn't practical. Colt at the other end of the table going through the rest of the papers in a separate methodical pass. They worked in the same room without talking much, which felt to Evelyn more intimate than conversation. There was something about working alongside someone in silence that asked a different kind of trust than words did. You had to believe without evidence in the moment that the other person was moving toward the same thing you were. She believed it. Around 11, she set down her pen and said, "There's something else." He looked up. "The Pulliam dispute," she said. "He's been contesting the Eastern Creek for 3 years. Has he ever produced documentation for his claim?" "A letter from the original land office," he says. "I've never seen it." "Has anyone verified it exists?" Colt was quiet. "No. Barron might be funding Pulliam's challenge," she said. "If the creek claim creates a clouded title, it makes your water rights harder to defend against the railroad right-of-way. 2 attacks on the same point from 2 directions." He stared at her. Then he said slowly, "I need you to say that again, because I've been fighting Pulliam for 3 years, and I have never once thought—" "You weren't looking at Pulliam as part of Barron's strategy," she said. "You were looking at him as a neighbor with a grievance. Once you change the frame, it's obvious." He sat back, ran his hand over his jaw, looked at the ceiling. 3 years, he said. "I've been fighting a proxy battle for 3 years." "Maybe," she said. "We need to verify it. But if we can establish that Pulliam's claim was manufactured or funded by the same party trying to acquire the right-of-way, then the whole thing collapses," he said. "The legal challenge, the railroad acquisition, all of it." It puts Baron in front of a land commissioner with a pattern of interference, instead of a straightforward purchase. And land commissioners in this territory do not like patterns of interference. It costs them work, and it costs them credibility, and they have long memories. Colt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Where did you learn all this?" "I told you, my father." She looked down at the letter she'd been writing. He was a clever man who made bad choices with his cleverness. I decided to be a clever woman and make better ones. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, with the house quiet around them, and the letter half finished between them, and said, "I want to say something to you, and I need you to not argue with it." She raised an eyebrow. "That's a considerable ask." "I know." He paused. "I'm glad you ran. I know that sounds wrong. I know what it cost you and what you went through, and none of that is something I'm glad about. But I'm glad you ended up here, in this house, at this table." He said it the way he said everything once, plainly, without decoration. "I just needed you to know that." She looked at him for a long moment. Her throat was doing something she didn't have full control over. "I'm glad too," she said. He nodded, looked back at his papers. She looked back at her letter. They kept working. It was past midnight when she finished. She set the pen down and flexed her fingers, and he looked up immediately, as if some part of him had been tracking her the whole time. "Done," he said. "Draft," she said. "Read it in the morning with fresh eyes, but it's there." He stood up and came around the table, and she handed it to him, and he read it all 3 pages, standing, not leaning on anything, reading with the full attention he brought to things that mattered. She watched his face and saw nothing change, which she was learning meant he was impressed and didn't want to oversell it. When he finished, he set it down and said, "You're dangerous." "I prefer thorough," she said. "Both," he said. She stood up, and her back ached from the chair, and she stretched without thinking about it. The unstudied stretch of someone who has forgotten they're being observed. And when she looked up, Colt was looking at her with the unguarded expression she'd seen only twice before, brief, real there, and then controlled. She thought of what Noah had said on the wagon, waiting for someone to make it worth taking back out. She thought, "I see it. I see what he's been keeping safe." She didn't say it. That was a conversation for a different night when they'd slept, and the letter was sent, and Baron had been answered on every front he'd opened. When the work was done, and there was room for the other thing. There would be room. She was sure of that now. "Get some sleep," he said. The same voice he used for everything. But something in it was different tonight, some texture she didn't have a word for yet. "You too," she said. She went upstairs. She heard him downstairs for a while longer, and then quiet, and she lay in the dark with his mother's ring on her finger and listened to the house around her. Solid still settled into its foundations, and thought, "This is mine now. I helped build something tonight. This is mine to help hold." She was asleep before the thought finished. In the morning, the letter would go to Billings. Baron would get his answer. And the real fight, the one she'd been running toward without knowing it, had a name, was just beginning. The letter went to Billings on the early rider, before Baron's men were awake enough to notice. Walt carried it himself. He didn't trust anyone else with it, and Evelyn didn't argue. She'd been up since before dawn making a second copy in her own hand, word for word, in case the first one disappeared on the road, the way things sometimes disappeared when powerful men had reason to want them gone. The copy went into the lining of Walt's coat. The original went in his saddlebag. He was on the road while the frost was still hard on the ground, and Noah was still asleep, and Colt stood at the door watching him go with his coffee going cold in his hand. "He'll make it," Evelyn said. "I know." He came back inside. "Baron's going to know we sent something the moment Walt rides past the hotel." "Good," she said. "Let him wonder what it says." Colt looked at her. "You're not worried." "I'm terrified," she said pleasantly. "But worry and action are different things, and only one of them does anything useful." He almost smiled. She was learning to catch the almost smiles, the small movements at the corner of his mouth that were as close as he usually got to showing what was happening inside. She was building a vocabulary for him, the same way she'd built one for legal documents, patiently paying attention to what was underneath the surface language. Noah came downstairs an hour later, with his hair at 4 different angles, and the particular expression of a child who has slept hard, and emerged with strong opinions. He looked at the table where Evelyn was reviewing the survey documents again, cross-referencing dates, and said, "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" "The face you make when you're thinking about things that make you mad." He sat down across from her. "Uncle Colt makes the same face when Pulliam sends letters." "We're working on the Pulliam situation, actually," she said. Noah's eyes went sharp with interest. "Did you figure out he's lying?" Both Colt and Evelyn looked at him. Colt set his cup down. "What do you know about Pulliam?" "Jeremiah's dad works for him," Noah said. "Jeremiah says his dad gets paid extra every spring to go say things at the land office. He thinks his dad's important." He shrugged with the devastating honesty of a 9-year-old. "I think Jeremiah's dad is getting used, but I didn't say that because Jeremiah's sensitive." Evelyn looked at Colt. Colt looked at Evelyn. "Noah," Colt said carefully, "what does Jeremiah's dad say at the land office?" "That the creek belongs to Pulliam. Jeremiah heard him practicing it." He reached across and stole a piece of bread from the board. "He practices it every year, like lines in a school play. Jeremiah thought it was funny. I thought it was weird." A paid witness. A rehearsed testimony. 3 years of it. "I need to talk to Jeremiah's father," Evelyn said. "He's scared of Uncle Colt." Noah offered helpfully. "Most people are." "He won't be scared of me," she said. Colt was already thinking through it. She could see him doing it. "If Pulliam's witness is paid and coached, and we can get him to say so, it doesn't just end the water dispute," she said. "It establishes the pattern. A coached witness, a forged betrothal document, a railroad right-of-way, filed the same month, Barron made contact with my father. 3 years of coordinated pressure on one property." She tapped the survey paper. "That's not a land dispute. That's a campaign. And William Charters in Billings is exactly the kind of man who will understand what a campaign means." Colt stood up, put his coat on. "I'm going to see Jeremiah's father." "I'm coming with you," she said. "Evelyn." "He's scared of you," she said. "You just heard. If you go alone, he closes up. If I'm there, it changes the dynamic. I'm not a threat. I'm a woman asking him to do the right thing." She was already reaching for her coat. "And I have a great deal of practice asking men to do the right thing in ways that make it feel like their own idea." He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door and held it open. "Noah," she said, "stay here." "I know." Noah said, already reaching for the bread again. "I always stay here. I'm very responsible." The man's name was Gideon Marsh, and he lived in a small house on the edge of Pulliam's property, with the specific air of a man who had made a series of small compromises over a long time, and was no longer entirely sure how he'd arrived where he was. He answered the door with the look of someone who'd been expecting something unpleasant and had simply not anticipated what shape it would take. He looked at Colt. His jaw tightened. He looked at Evelyn. Something shifted. "Mr. Marsh," she said. "My name is Evelyn Mercer. I'm not here to threaten you or your family. I'm here because I think you're a man who knows when something has gone further than he intended, and I'd like to give you the chance to step back from it before it costs you more than you've already paid." Marsh looked at Colt again. Colt said nothing. He was doing the thing she'd come to rely on, being present without pressure, holding space without filling it, letting her work. "I don't know what you mean," Marsh said. "You've been testifying at the land office every spring for 3 years, she said. "About the Eastern Creek on Mercer land. I'm not angry about it, Mr. Marsh. I understand that people do things for reasons that make sense at the time. What I need you to understand is that the man behind those reasons, the man paying for them, is not done. He's filing legal actions right now that are going to involve this county, this land office, and everyone whose name appears in the record, including yours." Marsh's hand tightened on the doorframe. "If his campaign succeeds," she continued, "your testimony becomes part of a fraud case. You're a witness in a property scheme. That's a different thing than a man who is asked to repeat some words once a year for some extra money. That's a crime." She let that sit exactly 1 second. But if you come forward now before the filing is complete, before Charters reviews our letter, you're not a conspirator. You're a witness for the other side. That's a very different position to be in." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her at the horizon, at nothing, at the particular distance men look at when they're deciding something about themselves. "Pulliam told me it was just a boundary thing," he said. "Said the creek was always supposed to be his, and the land office had made an error. Said he just needed someone to say so official-like." "And he paid you," she said. "Not an accusation, just a fact offered quietly." $20 a year, Marsh said. He sounded exhausted. "Lord, $20. I got a boy with a bad leg and the doctor costs." He stopped, looked at Colt. "I never wanted to cause you trouble, Mercer. I just needed the money." "I know," Colt said. It was the first thing he'd said. He said it without judgment, with a flatness that somehow contained more forgiveness than a softer voice would have managed. "I've got a boy I'd do things for too." Marsh closed his eyes for a moment, opened them. "What do you need from me?" "A written statement," Evelyn said. "What Pulliam told you, what he paid you, how many times, dated and signed. I'll write it here if you'll let me, and you'll read it before you sign anything." Marsh stepped back from the door and let them in. She wrote the statement at his kitchen table with his wife sitting in the corner, pretending to mend something and very obviously listening, and Marsh read it twice and signed it, and his hand shook a little, but it didn't stop. When they left, Evelyn had the statement folded in her coat pocket, and Colt had said fewer than 20 words the entire time, and they both knew the morning had just changed the shape of everything. "You didn't need me there," he said when they were back on the road. "I needed you there," she said. "When you said you'd do things for a boy too, he signed it 30 seconds later." Colt was quiet. "I meant it." "I know you did. That's why it worked." They rode back. Noah was at the window watching for them and disappeared from it a full 10 seconds before the door opened, pretending he hadn't been watching. Evelyn filed this away in the growing collection of things she loved about him without having decided to. The afternoon brought the first response from Billings. Not from Charters, too soon for that, but a writer from Walt, saying Charters had received the letter, had read it same day, and had sent word to Judge Haverford that any finding on the Barron filing was to be suspended pending a district review. Haverford's cooperation with Barron had just become expensive. Barron would know by evening. Evelyn sat with that and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the specific satisfaction of a move landing correctly, of 3 days of careful work connecting into something that held. Colt came and sat across from her and put the Marsh statement and the original survey documents and the railroad correspondence side by side on the table. "If Charters moves fast, he'll move fast," she said. "I wrote the letter so he'd want to." "How do you know what he wants?" "I wrote it so there was a villain, and he was the hero who stopped it," she said. "Men in positions like his respond to that. He gets to be the man who caught a railroad scheme in his district. That's not a burden. That's a story he tells for the rest of his career." Colt looked at her, then at the documents, then back at her. "You knew all that when you wrote it last night." "I hoped it," she said honestly. "Knowing and hoping are different. Last night I was hoping. This afternoon I'm knowing." He leaned back, and then he said very quietly the thing she hadn't known she was waiting for him to say. "I want you to know that none of this, what you've done these last 3 days, the letter Marsh, the way you talked to Barron, none of it is why I'm glad you're here." She looked at him. "It's part of it," he said. "I'd be lying if I said it wasn't, but it's not the reason." He looked at his hands, then at her with the directness he always managed when something really mattered. "The reason is the way you talked to Noah on the wagon, and the way you took your boots off like it was a decision, and the way you didn't cry when you had every right to, and you didn't pretend not to be scared when that would have been easier." He stopped. "I'm not good at saying things like this." "You're doing fine," she said. "I just need you to know it wasn't the documents." A pause. "Though the documents are extraordinary." She laughed. It came out before she decided to let it reel, and uncalculated, the kind of laugh that happens when something hits the right place at the right time. And his face did the thing again, the almost smile becoming for just a moment an actual one, and it rearranged his whole face into something she wanted to look at for a very long time. "I know," she said when she'd collected herself. "I know it wasn't the documents." She looked at him steadily. "And I want you to know that when I said I was glad this morning, I didn't mean glad the way you say it when something turned out all right. I meant glad the way you mean it when you realize you're somewhere you actually want to be. That you stopped running, not because you got tired, but because this is the place." He held her gaze. "This is the place," he said. She nodded. "This is the place." 2 days later, William Charters arrived in Black Hollow personally. He was a compact, precise man who looked at documents the way Evelyn did, front to back then, back to front then, sideways. And when he'd read everything, including the Marsh statement, he sat across from Colt and Evelyn at the ranch table and said, "Mr. Barron has a problem." "What kind of problem?" Colt said. "The kind that comes from using personal legal pressure to soften a land acquisition and leaving a paper trail." Charters folded his hands. "The betrothal document is void. The marriage certificate from Reverend Moss is valid and registered. The Pulliam water challenge is withdrawn pending investigation of the testimony. And the railroad right-of-way filing for this corridor has been flagged for review." He paused. "Mr. Barron is being asked to leave the county." Evelyn sat very still. "Asked," strongly Charters said, "with the understanding that if he returns, the next conversation will involve a federal land fraud inquiry rather than a county review." He looked at her. "The letter you wrote Mrs. Mercer was one of the most effective pieces of legal correspondence I've received in 20 years. I don't know your background." "I had a thorough education," she said. "In the wrong direction. I've been reapplying it." Charters nodded. He stood, shook Colt's hand, nodded to Evelyn, and left. They heard later that Barron had been on a southbound train before nightfall. The lean man went with him. The young rider who'd delivered messages was seen the following morning, eating breakfast at Pearl's alone, and when Pearl asked him what he planned to do, he said he wasn't sure, but he was thinking about staying. Pearl said she could use someone to fix the back stairs. He stayed. A week after that, Evelyn walked to the schoolhouse that sat empty on the far edge of town and looked at it for a long time. It had been empty for 2 years since the last teacher had left for Portland. It had 6 windows, 3 of which needed reglazing, and a stove that Pearl said had worked fine the last time anyone checked. She went home and talked to Colt about it. He listened, the way he listened to everything completely without interrupting, and when she was done, he said, "The county pays a teacher's salary, modest. Wouldn't make up for what you—" "I don't need it to make up for anything," she said. "I need it to be useful. I need something to do with what I know that builds something instead of just defending against something." She looked at him. "I spent 3 days tearing Barron's plans apart. I want to spend the next 30 years building something he couldn't touch." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The reglazing on those windows is straightforward. I can do it Saturday." "I know you can," she said. Noah, who had been listening from the hallway with the specific intensity of a child processing something important, appeared in the doorway and said, "If you're the teacher, do I still have to behave in school?" "Absolutely," Evelyn said. "That's what I was afraid of," he said, and went back down the hall. The school opened 6 weeks later. 14 children on the first day, 17 by the end of the month. Noah sat in the 3rd row and maintained an expression of determined neutrality that lasted approximately 4 minutes before he started answering every question which Evelyn had expected and privately counted as the best possible outcome. Spring came. The Eastern Creek ran clear and undisputed. The Billings Bank received its scheduled payment on time, and the loan would be paid off in 18 months instead of 2 years, because Evelyn had found a refinancing option in the contract language that Colt hadn't known was there. Pulliam filed no challenge that year. He filed no challenge the year after that either. Walt and Helen came for dinner on a Sunday in April, the anniversary of the wedding Moss had performed, and Helen brought a pie. Actual apple, not theoretical apple, and they ate it at the table that had become the center of something real, something that hadn't existed 7 months ago, and now felt like it had always been there, settled into its foundations, the way the house itself was settled. After dinner, while Walt and Colt talked on the porch, and Helen helped Noah with a school problem he was too proud to ask Evelyn about, Directly, Evelyn stood at the window and looked at the Montana mountains going gold in the late light, and she thought about the woman who had thrown a ring into the snow and chosen nothing. She had chosen correctly. Nothing had been exactly right. Nothing had been the open door, the empty road, the 43 cents and the 4 miles through the blizzard and the saloon, and the man who'd pulled her out of Decker's grip without raising his voice. Nothing had led here. She heard the porch door and felt him beside her before she turned the particular quality of his presence, that quiet weight. She'd come to read the way she read everything that mattered, with attention and without rushing. "Walt wants to know if we're planting the north pasture this year," he said. "We should," she said. "I ran the numbers last week. If we seeded in May, we recover the grazing loss from the flood year by fall. I'll tell him." He didn't move. Stood next to her, looking at the mountains. "You know, he asked me this morning how I found you." "What did you say?" "I said you walked out of a blizzard and sat down at my bar and told a man to take his hand off you." A pause. "He said that sounded about right." She smiled at the mountains. "It was your bar." "I've been going there 15 years. Close enough." She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her the way she'd caught him looking sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention steadily, the way he did everything with his whole self behind it and nothing held back. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the scarred side, and he went very still, the way he went still when something caught him off guard and he was deciding how to be with it. She'd learned that stillness. She trusted it. "I'm not running anymore," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to be sure you know," she said. "Not because of the ranch or the school or Noah, because of you, because of the man who stood in a saloon and said, 'Let her go,' without raising his voice, and meant it the same way he means everything completely once without decoration." He covered her hand with his. His voice, when it came, had that texture she'd heard for the first time in the kitchen 2 nights after they'd met and had been learning ever since. "I know," he said again, and this time it carried everything. She kissed him. Then, not the brief, proper thing in Moss's front room, but the real one, the one the title had promised from the beginning, the one that said, "I'm here, and I mean it. And this is not a strategy or a cover or a calculated move. This is just true." He kissed her back the same way. Outside, the mountains held their ancient shape against the dying light, and the creek ran east along the boundary of land that belonged to both of them now. And in the kitchen, a boy argued cheerfully with a woman who had chosen him the same way she'd chosen everything that mattered, deliberately, with her eyes open and without a single reservation. Evelyn Cross had run 1,000 miles to escape a life she hadn't chosen. She had walked four of them in a blizzard and sat down at a stranger's table and said her name like it belonged to her. It did. It always had. She had simply found the place where the rest of her life had been waiting, and she had the good sense and the courage and the absolute refusal to settle for less than real, to recognize it when she arrived.